And God spoke to Joshua, saying,
Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon,
I have given you.
Do not be afraid, nor be discouraged.
Do not be afraid, nor be discouraged.
For the Lord your God is with you.
For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
do not be afraid nor be discouraged.
For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
Well, this morning we are starting a new series, taking a look at the life of Joshua. And Joshua has been always one of those Bible characters that I've always been fascinated with, the backstory of where he came from and what he went through, combined with what lies ahead and what lied ahead for him once he became the leader of Israel, has always been fascinating. And so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be diving into the book of Joshua and discovering what does it mean for our life, and what were the principles that Joshua learned as he led Israel. What were the experiences that Joshua learned, or the things that Joshua learned as he experienced kind of his upbringing in Israel, that we can apply to our lives, that we can apply to who we are, not just, 5 years ago, or not just head knowledge, but heart knowledge. And I don't know if you remember growing up, one of the easiest ways to get someone to do something that was a little bit risky, or something that you just wanted them to do, you did one of two things. One is you either called them a scaredy cat, or two, you said, what, are you too chicken to do it? And if you really wanted to twist them a little bit, you'd start to cluck like a chicken. We've all done this, or we've all had it done to us because we wanted to egg them on a little bit. And here's the thing, we may have liked to do it to others, but we didn't like it when others did it to us, did we? Why is that? Because no matter what they dared you to do, it was never anything that was like a good outcome. Like, no one ever dared you to eat a bowl of chocolate ice cream, Unless you're lactose intolerant, then, okay, that might be a dare. But for most people, it's like, that's not really a dare. I don't have to be called a chicken to eat a bowl of chocolate ice cream. I'm gonna do that, I dare you to drive on the right side of the road, or are you too scared to do that? Well, no, that's what you do. You drive on the right side of the road. Now, some of you are going, no, you don't. Don't leave this morning, okay? It's always things that risk. I mean, how many of us guys, and girls, you may have this. I can't speak to this from the girls' experience because I'm not a girl. But guys, how many times have we smelled something because one of our friends dared us to, only to regret it in the end? And we're like, I really shouldn't have done that. But, I did it anyway. We have those things in life that people egg us on, that they tell us, do this, or are you too scared to do it? Are you too chicken? There's an element of surprise and uneasiness of whether we should do it or not. And I will admit, when it comes to adventures, I play it pretty safe. My pendulum doesn't swing too far to one extreme or the other. I've been whitewater rafting, and I absolutely loved it. I've been caving to the point of, when you're crawling through the cave, and, I had a hat on, and the top of the hat, you had to crawl on your belly, and it touched the top of the rock. I've been to those places. Now, obviously, it was a guided tour. It wasn't just some random cave I decided to do it, go in. I've been those things. I've been parasailing. I've been, snorkeling in the ocean. So I like to think my adventure scale is not completely like stay at home, don't, go out of the county type thing. But at the same time, I'm not going to jump out of an airplane. I don't care if I watch you do it 1,000 times. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to bungee jump. I'm not going to do the things that could result in my body not being the same if it fails than it is when I started. I have an uncle that I've lost count of the number of parachute jumps. And I know you can say, well, it's safe and you've got an instructor. Go for it. You can call me chicken all day. I am not going to change my mind on that. And we all have those things inside of us that spark fear, that spark this idea of, I don't care what you say, I'm not doing it. For some of you, what I'm doing right now is like, nope, I don't care how, what you say, there is no way I'm getting up in front of people and talking. You can call me chicken, you can call me scaredy cat all day. That's fine, because there is no way I'm doing that. And we all have those things inside of us that bring up those emotions of fear. Those things that we tell our kids. What do we tell our kids when they get a shot? Well, just be brave. Be brave and everything will be okay. And we all have those things. The question comes is when it comes to our relationship with Christ, and when it comes to our journey with Christ, how do we deal with those things? How do we have true courage? And what does that look like? And that's what we're going to spend a few minutes exploring this morning. If you want to follow along in your bulletins, there's a spot for you to do so. And as always, if you kind of go to the YouVersion Bible app, I know this morning I looked and there's a lot of RSM stuff at the top, so you may have to scroll down a little bit to get to the part, but it's there under the Rock Church. So just to find that, you'll find all the notes, you'll find all the scripture that we're going to use this morning. But before we begin, let's stop and ask God to speak to us. Heavenly Father, this morning we thank you for who you are. And over these next few moments, we need to hear from you. God, that's what we're here for. We're not here to hear from me. We're not just here to hear from each other. But Father, we're here to hear from you. And so will you open our ears that we may hear you? Will you open our hearts that we may understand and feel what you are saying so that it may change us? Because we're not just looking for head knowledge. God, we want to be transformed by you. We want to be different because of what you tell us today. And so, Father, over these next few moments, will you be the one that speaks? Will it be your voice that we hear? And we ask all this in your name. Amen. If you've got your Bibles, whether it's the hard copy version or whether it's the electronic version that you've got, if you want to open up to Joshua chapter 1, we're going to read the first 9 verses of the book of Joshua. And if you look at this, there's a lot to the book of Joshua. We are not going to hit on everything. It's going to kind of be like a little bit like David. And so maybe on your own, you want to start reading through the book because we're going to, like I said, we're going to jump, spend a lot of time on the beginning passages of it, but not get through all of it, all the book. But it's an incredible book to read. You've heard some stories. If you've been in, Rock Kids and you've been in Sunday school growing up, you've heard some of them. You maybe even know some songs that go along with Joshua. But there's a lot more to it. And so I encourage you to read this. But here's what the beginning of the book says. It says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And what's taking place in this passage is that Joshua is getting ready to lead the Israelites into the promised land. It's something that they've been looking forward to. It's something that has been on their radar for a long, long time. And now they are on the doorstep. And there's a little bit of a backstory, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But they're on the doorstep to what God has promised them. And as we read this passage, did you notice there was a phrase that kept coming up over and over again? If you go through and you look at these 9 verses, there's a phrase that's mentioned 3 times. And if you really want to narrow it down, it's actually mentioned 3 times in 2 verses. And it's interesting because 3 times God comes to Joshua and says, Joshua, you need to be strong. You need to be courageous. One time he even uses the phrase, you need to be very courageous. And it's interesting because we look at this phrase, we're like, okay, obviously that's a theme running through this, because if not, God wouldn't have said it 3 times. But what does that mean for Joshua? What does that mean for who we are? And the question becomes is, well, why do you think it's so prevalent? And some might say, well, God just wanted to make sure that Joshua was on the right track. That God is just reinforcing what is already there. It's kind of like the pregame speech. If any of you have ever played sports or been involved in something like that, you know that the pregame speech is sort of like a rah-rah, get your adrenaline pumping, because by that time, you're not going to tell them anything new. I mean, if you've ever coached a sport, you know that the pregame, you are not going to install something new because there's just no time to practice it. It's more of, let's just get the troops rallied, let's get them excited, and let's go out. That could be an option, but I don't think it's what we read here. I think the reason that we read 3 times that God had to tell Joshua, you need to be strong, you need to be courageous, is because there is some hesitation or fear on Joshua's part. That Joshua is looking at the task before him and going, as great as this is, and as long as we've been looking forward to this and all of that, there is some fear. There is some hesitation that is taking place because, God, I don't know if we can do this. I don't know if, God, this is a big task. Because here's the thing. We don't need to be told to be brave and be courageous when we're petting a little kitty, do we? We all like little kittens. They're harmless. We need to be brave. We need to be courageous when we're facing down the lion. And it's the lion that we're looking at. And so I think this is where Joshua finds himself. Joshua is staring at the teeth of the lion, and he's going, God, help. God, I don't know if we can do this. And this is where God comes in and says, Joshua, don't worry. Joshua, just be strong. Be courageous. And I think sometimes, and I've said this before, we have this tendency of superhero-fying the characters of the Bible. That somehow these guys are superhuman. They feel no pain. They have no fear. They're just like the ultimate, man or ultimate woman in some cases that we find in Scripture. But here, I think Joshua really does have some fear. I think there is some hesitation as to what is going on. And notice something here. God doesn't chastise Joshua for it. God doesn't come to Joshua and say, Joshua, you shouldn't be feeling this way. Now, he does tell him, do not be afraid. And we do need to learn how to deal with fear. And that's for another sermon. But God doesn't come to Joshua and say, Joshua, your fears are irrational. Joshua, your fears, they're just unfounded. Just put them out of your mind because Joshua, that isn't a factor right now. And I think when we look at this, that's so often how we deal with courage. We think that courage is the absence of fear. And it's interesting because Webster's in the dictionary kind of defines it a different way. Courage is not so much the absence of fear, but the ability to do something that frightens us. And I think this is where Joshua is in this moment. Joshua is staring down the promised land. They're on the doorstep. They can see it. Joshua has been there before. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. And now there is within inside of him some hesitation, some fear of, God, can we really do this? It is the belief that fear will not define me. And understand, this is more than just I'm going to jump out of the plane because I'm going to have courage and sure, the parachute will save me. And if not, I probably won't feel it in the end because I'm going to die. It's not even so much I'm going to bungee jump or I'm going to get up the nerve to ask that person out because they may say no. This is not the type of courage that we're talking about here. And this is not what Joshua needed. What Joshua had was God came to him and said, Joshua, here's what I want you to do. And Joshua was like, wow, that's a big ask. That's something big. Okay, God, as much as I don't know the outcome of this, as much as I don't know what's going to happen, God, I'm going to have courage. God, I'm going to go out on a limb, and I can't let my fear define me. And so what does that look like for you and I? Because if it's not jumping out of the airplane, if it's not bungee jumping, if it's not getting up on a stage and speaking, how does that apply to us? Because we don't have a promised land. We're not staring down and go, this is, we're going to take Red Key, and that's our promised land, and we're going to go, no. We're not going to start a war or anything along that lines. So what does it mean for us? What does it mean for you and I this morning? Because I think God calls us, all of us, to do things that will stretch us. To do things that will cause some hesitation on our part. From the human side of things, to cause some fear. And so how does this apply to all of this? Because it wasn't just Joshua that God was telling to be strong and courageous. He's telling you and I to do those same things. And so there are 2 things. First, I think we need to realize the biggest hindrance to courage. Do you remember Superman? I mean, faster than a speeding bullet, stronger than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. I'm sure you've seen the movies and all of those things. I mean, Superman was the man's man. I mean, there was nothing that would stop Superman. Except what? Kryptonite. You got Superman around kryptonite. I don't care how big and bad he thought he was. I mean, it like sapped his strength like that. And it didn't just sap his strength for a little while. It sapped his strength for he had to take some time to recoup all of that. Here's the thing. Courage has a kryptonite. And forgetfulness is courage's kryptonite. And some of you are thinking, man, I am in trouble because I could not find my car keys this morning. How many of us have ever forgotten where we put our cell phone? And we had to have someone else in the house call it because we're like, I don't know where it was. And then that's when we put it like on silent and well, that didn't help, or the battery dies. And so some of you are thinking, man, if this is courage's kryptonite, I am in trouble because I am forgetful. Don't worry. You can forget where your cell phone is and you can still have courage. And the Israelites are a great example of this. And this is where Joshua chapter 1, it's sort of like jumping into the story halfway. It's sort of like we're sitting down at the movie and the movie is half over and we're like, okay, what happened to get us to this point? Because what has happened to get the Israelites to this point is crucial with what I think God tells Joshua, or why he tells Joshua to be strong and courageous. And it starts all the way back in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, God comes to a man by the name of Moses. And he tells Moses, listen, I've heard the groaning of my people. I've heard the Israelites groaning. They have been enslaved in Egypt, and I've heard them crying out to me, and I'm going to come, and I'm going to set them free. And so he comes to Moses, if you've read about the burning bush experience, and says, Moses, you're going to be the guy that sets the people free. And so Moses kind of begins this conversation as to, well, how does this happen? And you have to understand, this is no small task that God is doing. This is not like, okay, we need to sneak a couple people out the back door. The Israelites have been enslaved for about 430 years, give or take. And we're not sure the exact numbers, but it is estimated that by the time God begins to deliver the Israelites, there are about 2 million Israelites. Okay? That's a large number of people. All right? You're not just going to sneak them out the back door. Let's wait till night falls and let's go quickly. No. And so what happens? God comes to Moses. Moses says, Moses, you need to go before Pharaoh. You need to tell Pharaoh, you need to let my people go, or else. I mean, it's a Cliff Notes version, but that's what happens. Pharaoh, in his cockiness, essentially says to God, God, bring it. God says, fine. There's going to be 10 plagues. And 10 plagues ravage Egypt, except for the Israelites. The Israelites are spared from these plagues. Finally, Pharaoh relents and says, I've had enough. Go. Oh, and by the way, when you're going, take some stuff with you because just get out. And 2 million people, 2 million Israelites walk out of Egypt. And they come to this body of water called the Red Sea. And they've got the Red Sea on one side. And then by this time, Pharaoh has realized that when you let 2 million of your workforce go, forced as it was, it puts Egypt in a bind. And so Pharaoh has a change of heart and says, I'm not going to let you go anymore. In fact, I am now going to come and I'm going to pursue you. And so the Israelites come out. They've got the Red Sea on one side. They've got Pharaoh's army approaching on the other. And listen to what they tell Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? It's kind of always nice. Hindsight is 20/20. They're like, hey, we would have been better off in Egypt. Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the desert. They're like, it's certain doom. And God says, don't worry. I'm sorry, that's not what they told the Israelites. That's later on. I skipped a portion. They cry out to God. God says, don't worry, I've got this handled. Moses, raise your hand. The Red Sea parts. Moses and all the Israelites pass by on dry ground. After that, Pharaoh's army starts to cross the Red Sea. God says, Moses, put your hand down. And God floods the Red Sea again and wipes out Pharaoh's army. And so the Israelites are on one side. They've been delivered from the hand of Pharaoh. They've been delivered from the army. Then you get to Exodus 14, and this is what this passage is from. Because now they're saying, okay, Moses, it's great, but we don't have any food. You know, we're out here starving to death. You know, all of these things that are taking place, you know, we just don't have. And Moses says, okay, if this is the case, then here's what you're going to find. It says, they continue, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. Again, you see this thing coming again. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us into this desert to starve this assembly to death. So what's happened? Well, you've got God has delivered the Israelites from Egypt. He delivered them at the Red Sea. Then they come to him and say, God, we don't have any food. And God says, okay. Later on, that evening, quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? It's why we call it manna. And manna isn't like another term for bread. Manna is the question, what is it? So it's what they called it, because they didn't know what it was, which makes sense. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. And so you have this, the food is there. They cry out to God, or they cry out to Moses and say, Moses, you're going to kill us all. Great, we should have been back in Egypt, because at least we had food back in Egypt. You know, God says, don't worry, I'll provide for you. Fast forward. It's now no longer about food, it's now about water. And there's a lack of water that's going on. You're like, well, in the desert, that's a pretty important thing. So what do the Israelites do? Check out what they say. You catching a theme here? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children, so they're adding a little bit twist it now. It's not just us now, it's us and our children, and our livestock die of thirst. We're slaves in Egypt. God set them free. They're faced with Pharaoh's army against the Red Sea. God delivered them. They're faced with no food. God provided. Now they're crying out, there's no water. God's like, guess what? I will provide. The Lord answered Moses, go out in front of all the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. And so God provides. You get to Numbers chapter 13 and chapter 14. They get to the promised land. And they send some spies into the land because they want to scout. They want to see what is there. They know this is the destination. And if you know the story, they send 12 spies into the land. And they come back and there's this glowing report. I mean, it is just, there's fruit. There is, lush fields. There's just everything you could want. There's just one problem. There are giants in the land, or there are people that look like giants. And out of the 12 spies, 10 say we can't take the land. 2 of them say we can. God's on our side. The 2 spies are Joshua and a man by the name of Caleb. And what happens is they put it to a vote. And guess what? The 10 went out. And Israel says, we're not going to take the promised land. We're going to go and we're not going to fight. And God says, because of that, for 40 years you will wander the desert until every one of this generation that is voted to not enter the promised land is gone, except for 2, for Joshua and for Caleb. Well, what's happening here? Why do you have all these stories? Well, the Israelites are forgetting what God has done. I mean, think about it. You've been set free from in slavery for 430 years by 10 plagues. God has rescued you from the hand of an army by the Red Sea. God has provided you food. God has provided you water. And yet when you look at this, it's almost like the Israelites go, well, I don't know what God's done for me lately. It's like, come on. When they got to the promised land, it should be, this is no big deal because look at what God has done for us. Look at how God has provided. How could we not trust what he says to us? But the Israelites, they have a forgetful memory. And that's why when it comes to Joshua chapter 1, I think that's why he has to remind them, Joshua, be strong, be courageous, because the source of courage is not what we have done, but is on what God has done. Now, Joshua would have experienced all of that, or at least most of that. If nothing else, the Israelites would have heard the stories. They knew the Exodus if they weren't there. I mean, your younger generation would be the older generation now. So there would be some, that the very young generation in Joshua chapter 1 wouldn't have been alive then. But they would have heard the stories. They would have heard passed down as to what God had done in Egypt, what God had done in the Red Sea, what God had done with the manna. They'd probably tasted the manna at some point, what God had done with the water in the rock. And so all of these things happen, and all of a sudden, courage is trusting in God and remembering how he has provided in the past. I mean, put yourselves in the shoes of the Israelites. If you had experienced all of that, how could you doubt God? How could you doubt God that when he says, now take the promised land, that he was anything but serious that you'll be victorious in it? Go back to Exodus chapter 3. This has been the theme all along. This has been where he has taken the Israelites. It's not like God all of a sudden threw a detour in the midst. He comes to Moses and says, Moses, I'm telling you, this is where I'm taking you. I mean, if you want to go back to Genesis. In Genesis, he tells Abraham, this land that you see, it's going to be your ancestors. Your people are going to live there. I mean, it's easy for us to play the hindsight is 20/20 game, isn't it? I mean, we look at them, man, how could the Israelites not have had the courage? I mean, come on, we read these stories, and we've been like right there with Joshua. We would have been right there with Caleb. If we were the one of the spies, it would have been 9 versus 3, because we would have stood. Let's face it, we know the end of the story. I mean, it is very easy to go to the end of the story and go, wow, good guys win in the end. Let's be with Joshua and Caleb. But how many times in our own life do we fall into the same trap the Israelites do? We see how God has provided time and time again for us, how God has shown up. And yet when he asks us to do something, we go, God, I don't know if I can do that. God, I don't know if I have the courage to do that. Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, verse 31, what then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And true, we may not have the Red Sea experience. We may not have the experience where God has parted the seas and we walk through on dry ground. We may not have the experience where, God has brought food down from heaven, or water from a rock, or we may not have entered the promised land. And so we could look at this and go, well, yeah, those were big things. I mean, those were like monumental things that God did. That why wouldn't have that affected the way Israel interacted with him? But in a way, we do have the Red Sea experience. In a way, we have been set free. And it all started 2,000 years ago when God said, I'll provide a way that man can come back to me. And that way is through what Christ did on the cross. I mean, it is those moments that when you have that happen, God steps in and God says, I will provide a way when there is no other way. I'll step in and I'll provide for you so that when it comes time to be tested, when it comes time that you need courage, you have that ability. You have something to draw back on. This is what God has done for me here, so I will trust him here. And that's what we need. That's where our source of courage comes from. It is not the fact that we can be big, we can be brave, we can be strong because we've done it all on our own. It is from the standpoint, this is what God has done for us here, so I will trust him here. I don't know if you know this about me. I love nature shows. And I'm not the kind of the nature show like, oh, look at the hummingbird as it, flies. I'm more of the nature show, look at the zebra as it pounces and look at the lion as it stalks the zebra. That's my nature show. Or look at the baby antelope as it goes down to the water to drink, and then it shows the picture of the big crocodile going, I'm hungry. I know some of you may be like, that's cruel. That's nature. I mean, you could tell that alligator be a vegetarian, and I don't think he'll listen. Those are I like those shows, I admit. And I'm fascinated by animals. You take me to the zoo, and Aaron's, doesn't like this. I can just stand and watch some of them sometimes, and and marvel at how God has made them. And one of the animals that I find particularly interesting is the rhinoceros. You'll see a picture of him there. You get the horn, which if you think about it, that horn is the same material that our fingernails are made out of. I mean, it's just this incredible thing. And, if you ever meet one of these in the wild, forgetting trying to outrun them, okay? Because rhinoceroses can reach top speeds of anywhere between 30 and 40 miles an hour, okay? So, that thing's moving, all right? And none of you can run 30 or 40 miles an hour. I don't care how fast you think you are, all right? There's just one problem with the rhinoceros. The rhinoceros has very poor eyesight, okay? And it's hard because you can't really take a rhinoceros and go, okay, read the letters. We don't know how poor, but scientists and conservation officers and people that's zoologists, they've figured that a rhinoceros's eyesight is probably about 100 feet. That's what they can see, okay? That creates a little bit of a problem. Because if you're running at 30 or 40 miles an hour at top speed, and you can only see 100 feet in front of you, don't try this at home, but drive your car 30 or 40 miles an hour when you can only see 100 feet in front of you. It's not going to end well for you. You're going to run into something. But you look at this rhinoceros, and the rhinoceros will charge. If they see something, or it catches their eye, they will charge, and they don't care what is at the 101st feet. Why? Because when you're as big and as strong as the rhinoceros is, and you can run 30 or 40 miles an hour, it doesn't matter what is at the 101st feet. Because you're bigger. You're stronger. You've got the momentum that I can run over anything that gets in my way, unless it's a brick building, It's also why a herd of rhinoceroses, or rhinoceri, I don't know what the term is, the official term is, okay? Guess what they're called? They're called a crash. You look at this and go, that takes some courage. We need to be like that. Because guess what? As big and as bad as a rhinoceros is and as strong as they are, and as you would not want to meet one in the wild because it will run you down and it will trample you and it will not feel good. And it will run as hard as it can because it knows that it can. When it comes to you and I, we have the power of God on our side. We have the Spirit of God in us. And so when God says run, and when God says go, God says, I don't care what is at the 101st foot. I don't care if you can see that. I just want you to run and trust me. Trust me that I know what I'm asking you to do. Have the courage to run with all of your might, because with me behind you, it doesn't matter what lies ahead. And I think we can take a lesson from the rhinoceros. We can take a lesson from Joshua, because I don't know this morning what you need courage for. I don't know what this morning God is saying, you know what, I want you to do this. And you're like, God, I don't know, because I don't know how it's going to end up. And God's like, don't think about how it ends up. Just run. Run with all that you have. Run with all the strength that I'm going to give you, because you know what? You're going to learn something about yourself. This morning, may you learn from Joshua and the Israelites that courage is not the absence of fear, but courage is the ability to do something that frightens us. May you never forget how God has provided for you. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you've been through. There are ways that God has provided for you, and yet so often we forget those things. And may you realize courage is not dependent upon what you can do, but on what God has done for you. And may you run with the courage of the rhino. Because with God on our side, when we follow where He leads, and that is a big key in all of this. It is not going where we want to go. It is not doing what we want to do. It is following where He wants us to go and what He wants us to do. And when you have the courage to do that, it doesn't matter what's at the 101st foot, because God is on your side. Will you have the courage to run? Will you have the courage to obey? Will you have the courage to do whatever it is God is calling you to do? Heavenly Father, this morning we thank you for who you are. And Father, for the pictures of Scripture. And for this man of Joshua who on the precipice of leading his people into battle. and leading his people to seize the promised land, you reminded him, Joshua, be strong, be courageous. And you can almost hear the doubt in his mind going, is now the time? Can we really do this? Then you stepped in and said, Joshua, I've got this. Follow me. And God, there are times in our life where we hear the term or we hear you say, follow you, and we get scared. We get scared to have that conversation. We get scared to be obedient. We get scared to do whatever it is that you're calling us to do, and we lack the courage. And so, Father, this morning, you are calling us to do some incredible things. You have not called us to a safe life. You have not called us to a life of mediocrity. But, Father, you have called us to a life of adventure. You have called us to a life of meaning. And to do that, we need to trust you. And we need to have that courage that when your voice speaks, we can run. And so, Father, this morning, for those that are timid, may we gain strength from the examples that we've seen. May we gain strength from the ability to say, God, I will trust you. And even though I am scared, even though I can't see what lies ahead, God, I will trust and I will run because I know I'm not running alone. God, may we have the courage to follow you wherever you lead us. God, thanks for Joshua. Thanks for the encouragement to be strong, to be courageous. God, may we walk out of here with a courageous heart because of what you have done for us. And we ask all this in your name.